Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Pehchan, where we unpack the stories and identities of extraordinary Pakistani Americans. Today, I've got one of the coolest human beings I know. Ambreen Ali is definitely not your typical Desi auntie. She's a journalist. She's a founder of the Central Desi newsletter, which just won an $80,000 grant, by the way. We're going to talk to her about her life, her identity, her career, and what it means to be a part of the brown woman revolution in America in 2023. So, Amreen, first of all, welcome to the show. We're so happy you're here.
Thank you so much. I'm so honored to be here.
So, Amreen, let's start with the beginning. Talk to me about what your childhood was like. What was it like growing up? What was family like? What was school life like?
Sure. I actually immigrated to the United States when I was 5. So sometimes I think about that as the beginning of my journey, but obviously there were these 5 years that came before it. I was born in Riyadh, and then I think my parents
What?
had.
You were born in Riyadh? I was also born in Riyadh, but keep
Oh,
going.
really?
Okay. I mean, sorry, I wasn't born in Riyadh. I spent 8 years of my life in Riyadh. I'm so excited that somebody's from Riyadh that I thought I was born in Riyadh. All right, keep going.
Yeah, it's on my passport, but I think when I was 2, my parents found out that they were like their application for a visa to the United States had been accepted, so they had to go back to Pakistan to do the whole process. So then I was in Lahore for maybe 3 years, and then I came to the United States. So I have little glimpses of like memories from both of those places. From Riyadh, maybe like I just remember like the gate at our house. Like I don't know if I imagine or reimagine these things or if they're real. In Pakistan, we were actually there during the Benazir Bhutto Nawaz Sharif election, which was kind of cool. I think it was in the late 80s, and I'll have to fact check that. But I remember because my parents like voted for opposite candidates, and I remember it being kind of like they're giving each other a hard time about it. Um, and then I came to California. That's where I actually grew up, is San Jose, California. And what was school like? I mean, it was disorienting. I spoke Urdu first, and so I was learning a new language. I was learning a new culture. A lot of times, my parents didn't really know how to help me navigate that. So I remember little things like asking my teacher if I could take some paper home, and she asked if I wanted thick paper or thin paper, and I didn't know what either thing meant, and just feeling like
Wow.
I just don't know these things. Like I don't know. And so, yeah, it was pretty disorienting for a long time, maybe the whole time, maybe even up to high school. I was always like one step behind everybody else because I was like learning so quickly. Um, yeah.
Wow. And talk to us a little bit about what brought your parents to the US, because that'll then help us understand sort of the context that you were sort of in as well. So talk to us about what brought them to the US.
Yeah, I don't have an easy answer for this. It's something I still try to figure out. We immigrated in 1990, so we weren't part of like any of the earlier waves, where people came because they had like, admission to a university or had a job. My dad loves loved American culture, I guess I should say, until he got here. He loved like Western movies. He was obsessed with Hollywood. He thought he looked like Gregory Peck. And he had spent a lot of his youth in Austria, where he studied, and Europe, and he was just so enamored by the West. So I don't know how it worked, but my mom had a brother who was in Ohio and a practicing doctor. So they, people who were already here could apply for family visas. And in the 80s, a lot of the South Asians that came were relatives of people who had come in the 60s. So I don't know if it was like part of the arranged marriage agreement, like, oh, she has this like way for you to get to America, and he's like, okay, I'll marry her, and then they immediately put the visa application in or something. I don't know. I do know that uncle of mine, that Mamu, he was married to a white woman, and they came to Saudi Arabia and celebrated Christmas with us in Saudi Arabia. So we have these pictures, like my parents got a Christmas tree, and
Christmas in Riyadh.
I know, I was like, what is going on? But anyway, I think he just wanted to
Wow.
be here. I think he saw opportunity. If I've asked him, and he always says like, I did it for my kids, and I want to believe that. But I also think like we do things for ourselves, like a lot of my relatives are still in Lahore. So, he was definitely the one that chose to leave. And I think he really liked the culture here. And Funny enough, I don't think he could have anticipated it, but I feel like he really changed the trajectory of life for me and my sister in particular.
Mm-hmm.
Because, my female cousins in Pakistan have led very different lives. They just
Mm-hmm.
haven't had the opportunities to kind of have serious careers. They all had marriages when they were young, they all have a lot of children. And I just feel like that decision he made just changed everything for me. But I still don't really know why he did it. And I know that my mom didn't want to come. I remember her crying a
Oh,
lot when we
really? And why
she,
is that?
she just wanted to be with her family. She's the youngest, she's a baby, and she's the youngest of 12 siblings, mashallah. So
Oh,
you
wow.
can imagine she has a huge tribe. And now most of them are abroad in various places too. Actually, a lot of them are in New York, New Jersey, which is where I'm based.
Mm-hmm.
But at the time, like, I just don't think she wanted to leave Pakistan. She loved it. And I think coming here was really scary for her. I think my entire childhood was shaped by the fact that my mom didn't trust American culture. So she was so, like, she just kept us so close. She wouldn't let us do after school activities. She wouldn't let us go to the mall.
Wow.
She's just like, I got to keep you close. I have to. It was like her mama bear, like
Mm-hmm.
protective. She's like, everybody out there is just doing haram things all the time, and you got to stay away from them. So I think she really struggled with it. But oddly enough, I would say today they're almost the opposite. My mom is pretty, like, she likes America. Her life trajectory, we can talk about it more, changed a
Mm-hmm.
lot. She has a career, and my dad, I think, really misses, like, he's always romanticizing like his been in Pakistan. I think he would love to go back and just like live that simple life again.
Wow. It's so interesting because the entire sort of purpose of this podcast is to explore identity journeys. And it's so interesting that your dad and mom flip places by the
Yeah.
end of it. And nobody really has any idea where we're all going with this. But so, Amreen, talk to us a little bit. You said your cousins were, still back in Pakistan. You can sort of compare and contrast life trajectories. But take us back to your childhood. Um, when you were growing up, your mom was trying to be protective. You were sort of in school, sort of in the US. Were you going back and forth to Pakistan? Like, did you guys go for like an annual summer trip to Pakistan? And how was, like, as a child, when you remember taking consciousness, like, were you aware of the fact that you were different? And how did that play out, like, in your day to day life?
I really love this question because, of course, as I've become an adult, I've made a lot of Pakistani American friends, and I've realized how different our experiences are. Like, there are the people who did the annual trips home. We didn't. We went back once, I think maybe like 2 or 3 years after we got here, and that was like our big visit, and maybe the hope was that we would do that frequently, but we
Mm-hmm.
didn't end up doing it that often. I think we did that one trip, and then um, I think my dad went back a couple times. My mom had already lost her dad, but then my nanny also passed away in that time. So they lost, like, once their parents started passing away. I think they lost like the they didn't want to go home. It was so painful to go home. Maybe
Mm.
like that sense of home was gone. They're staying with like siblings, but then they're staying with their siblings' families, and they still go even now, but it changed. So I just went back that one time in
Oh, wow.
1993, and then we all went back when I graduated from college. We went back for a trip,
Mm.
which was really cool to go there, like
Mm-hmm.
when I was 21, and to go with my whole family. And then more recently, we've all gone back. I guess now it's been 5 years, right before COVID. But when I was growing up, it wasn't going to Pakistan that made me feel Pakistani, but yeah, I knew I was different all the time because my parents were like super super fobby, and I say that with a lot of love. My dad maybe a little less so, but my mom was like, she was always wearing shalwar kameez. We only ate Pakistani food. They talked to each other in Punjabi day in day out. They talked to us in Urdu. I don't think they were doing it like as a way of like how I would with my kids, like, hey kids, you need to learn Urdu. No, it was just like it was who they were. It was imbued in their being, and so we just absorbed it so much. And then, like I mentioned, a lot of our family was still in Pakistan, but we did have three of my dad's cousins, kind of his younger cousins who were in their 20s at that time, my chachas, in San Jose with us. So we would see them
Mm.
every weekend, and so we would get a lot of that cultural touch point, when we were all together as a family. And then we had these like kind of third cousins in LA, and we would go down for trips to visit them, and they would have these like all their kids were at the age where they were getting married, like epic shadis where everybody's like, you really felt the culture. I feel like our weddings really showcase our culture, So that was it. But I guess like in the car, we would go on road trips, and my dad would always put in like at that time it was cassette tapes, but like Rafi or Lata. We would listen to. Ultimately, I think we got a CD player, and then we were listening to a lot of Nusrat. Like, yeah, the soundtrack of my upbringing was Pakistani, I guess. Even though, like, really, I grew up here.
That's so fascinating. Did you get frustrated by this? Did you rebel at any point? Like, I'm still in your school sort of years. Like, how did you sort of take the juxtaposition of your home life, which is almost like a time travel to, or like a geographical travel to another place, and where you were actually physically spending your day sort of in school? How did you navigate those two worlds?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I was the second kid. So my sister is the eldest, and she was the good child. So yes, I was super rebellious, but I wasn't rebellious against being Pakistani. I was rebellious against the rules and the kind of the ways that my parents were so restrictive. Like they did not like. I was on the phone all the time with my friends. I had these like four friends that we were kind of a crew, and we would talk all the time and write letters to each other. And as like I became a preteen, like we talk about crushes that we had, and we were interested in boys and giggling about that stuff. And I think at that age, I really started to struggle because my parents were like, "No, don't talk to the boys when you're at school." Like literally, my dad told me that once. I got excited because like one of my classmates had. Like his dad was in the same line of work as my dad, and I told my dad that, and he just was like, "Why did you talk to him?" I was like, what? I was like, do you have any idea what school is like? Like, how could I possibly not talk to it? Like, they were just so rigid and disconnected from what it was like to be an American kid.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the ways in which I rebelled. Definitely. Like I never did anything that serious when I was younger. But after a while, like it's just like I felt like we had a very don't ask, don't tell policy in the house. Like I just like stopped sharing parts of myself at home. But I don't know if you can tell just from my expression, but I feel like there's a lot of pain there too. Even
Yeah.
now, I just feel like, yeah, it wasn't easy having to fight my parents on that. And this might bring us to the present day and the talk that I gave at South by Southwest. But I kind of felt like, they were like, "Are you trying to become American?" They would always say that to me. And I would think, like, no, I'm not. Like at that time, I wasn't trying to become American. But as an adult now, as an American adult, I've spent my
Mm-hmm.
whole life here. I think to myself, like, I had to become an American. Like, you brought me here.
Mm-hmm.
Why didn't you expect me to become an American? Why were you making me feel bad for trying to fit in, right? And I was such an awkward kid. Like, I always had the wrong clothes. I just, like, didn't know how to. I was so uncomfortable in my own skin. Like, I was so tall. I'm 5'10", and I think I've been that tall since I was maybe in like middle school. So and like my parents didn't allow me to do things, so I was like the weird kid, like the wasn't allowed to do whatever. I couldn't eat the pepperoni pizzas. I couldn't go
Mm-hmm.
on the like class trips. Like I wasn't allowed to go to the dances. Like I was just like the weird kid in my head, and I don't even know if that was true. Actually, in
Mm-hmm.
San Jose, probably like most of my school was Asian immigrants. That's the interesting
Mm-hmm.
thing is I grew up with a lot of Vietnamese kids whose parents were refugees from the war. And in retrospect, I realized that. But at the time, I just thought everybody else is American and my parents are weird,
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I can laugh about it now, but it was hard, like it was definitely hard. And then of course they were like study, study, study. I was an epic nerd, so I got made fun of for being a nerd too.
Wow, that's the double whammy. Something you said, it just touched me in so many different ways. You talked about, living a double life and don't ask, don't tell. Even though I'm a boy, and even though I didn't sort of, grow up in the U.S., I've had that relationship also. And I'm almost afraid to say it live because my parents are going to see this podcast. And even this podcast, like, even though I'm such a grown up, like, father of a kid now, but I'm still worried that they're going to see parts of my personality in me in this podcast that they don't know about.
Yeah.
and how quote unquote Americanized I've become, for lack of a better word. And I'm like, it's so interesting. Like and that has had so many implications on how I've grown up, like my relationship with my partner, my, the fact that, it almost becomes a thrill to live a double life.
Mm.
And then you rebel against the double life, and you're constantly, and then over time you become unclear about who you really are, and which one is the real you, and which values are yours, and which values are sort of assigned, and which
Yeah.
values you're sort of acting out. There's so much there. So when you said it, I was like, oh, like we there's just so much there to sort of unpack.
Absolutely. And yeah, I feel like I have four different things I want to say about that, but I will mention, I feel like the thing with don't ask, don't tell, and this is just a cultural difference between Americans and Pakistanis, is that in Pakistani culture, don't ask, don't tell is a form of respect. So
Mm.
my male cousins, for example, I have a younger like Mamu who passed away of lung cancer. He smoked like a
Mm.
chimney. His son used to smoke, still smokes cigarettes,
Mm.
right? He would not smoke in front of his dad, but
Mm.
obviously, like his dad knew he was smoking, right?
Mm.
Like if you smoke cigarettes, like everybody knows you smoke.
Mm. Mm.
But for him to light a cigarette in his dad's presence was extremely disrespectful. It was not a thing he would ever do, even though
Mm.
everybody knows, right?
Mm.
So that, to an American kind of like lens, might look like you're hiding something, you're pretending. But actually, in our culture, like you show respect to your elders by not throwing it in their face that you're disobeying them.
Mm.
You know,
Mm.
so, like, for example, like I'm, married to my husband who I met when I was 21 and I got
Mm.
married to him when I was 25. So for those
Oh,
4 years,
wow.
yeah, for those 4 years, I had to lie to my parents a lot. And they kind of knew about it the whole time. And so they kind of expected me to lie about it. And so I wrestle with that don't ask, don't tell thing because it's just, if you look at it in the lens of our culture, it's just different. Like our Pakistani culture, it's just different how
Mm.
parents kind of almost expect that. But
Mm.
then, when I think about me being a mom and how I'm raising my own kids, like that's not something I want to replicate at all. I
Mm.
want them to be one version of themselves with everybody in every room they ever go into. Like that's nobody can really do that, but like that's my goal. And
Mm.
you mentioned as soon as you said like your parents are going to listen to this, I'm like, oh no. I was like, what are auntie and uncle going to think of me? Like, right here I am. I'm like,
Yeah.
yeah, I used to like have crushes on boys. Like
Mm.
it's ingrained in us to care about that.
Mm.
I cannot help myself. If I see an elder, they see auntie or uncle, I change. I become a
Mm.
different version of myself. I know how to present myself in that setting to show respect, and I
Mm.
do that automatically. And I don't think it's a bad thing. But this code switching and how you said that it's thrilling, maybe that's so interesting because I never thought about it like that. But it's something that can become second nature and
Mm.
then it's hard to stop doing. Like my mom once told me, she was like, Ambreen, you're like a chameleon. And she did not mean it as a
Mm.
compliment, and I think about that a lot. Like, and I've tried, and she told me that when I was 20, and I'd like to say like, almost 20 years later that I am less of a chameleon. I try really hard to be my whole self all the time. Like just the way I'm sharing with you right now, I
Mm.
would not have shared so openly about my life. And what you were saying about just podcasting and struggling with that, I think the same thing as a writer. I've tried to push myself to write more authentically and be more honest, but I'm also very aware that like that's not how my family like raised me. To us it was like you don't talk about your business out in
Mm.
public. You don't tell people what's happening. Like why would you air your laundry out like that? So I really struggle with that still. But I do think ultimately this push, like we're living in this cultural era of like being authentic and honest and just having these conversations. I believe in it because part of me feels like when I say that, like when I said don't ask, don't tell, and it resonated for you, we feel community with each other. We feel
Mm.
seen, right? And so for other Desis, especially other Desi women, for us to be able to kind of process like all the crazy stuff our parents put us through, like I mean, I got in so much trouble when like a boy would call the house, and when I was in high school, one of my classmates lived right next door. He still lives there, like his parents still live there, and my parents are friends with his parents, right? Like they're
Mm.
neighbors. But one summer day, Matt decides to come knock on my door just to see how I'm doing and what's going on. And my dad flipped out at me. You know,
Wow.
first of all, he was just like, why did he come to the door? And like, you know, like as soon, like he sent him on his way. And then as soon as he shut the door, it was like, it was my fault. Like somehow I had, you know, arranged for Matt to come over and ring the
Yeah.
doorbell and ask my dad if I was home. Like, am
Mm-hmm.
I stupid? You
Mm-hmm.
know? But that's like a story that so many of my Desi friends, like they're like, they have a similar
Yeah.
story. And so when we share with each other, we feel less alone, right? And I think that's important. Like so much of what I'm describing about my childhood was a feeling of being alone. My parents didn't get me, my classmates didn't get me. I was this weird hybrid and I didn't have community, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Wow. And that's really sort of the purpose of the podcast as well, which is to bring these conversations to the public sphere and to make us
Yeah.
realize that we're not alone. But when you're talking and sharing this, there's a part there's a part of me that's reliving all my childhood traumas, and I'm just like,
I'm sorry.
why did we have to go through that? And the one curiosity that I have, or question that I have, is, did you ever have like as you grew up, like have a moment of reckoning with your parents or with your therapist? Like even with my therapist, you know how therapists are like, oh, everything, you know, you blame your mom, like everything comes from your parents. And I'm like, you know, for a long time I was like, no, my parents are great, like they've done nothing wrong, and I still believe that they're amazing human beings, and I'm so privileged and lucky to be their children. But I'm like, yeah, there were things that were weird, but I still am afraid, even to my therapist. Like, I'm like, you know, I still can't say the words. I still can't have a conversation with them and be like, you know, you did
Yeah.
this to me, and that kind of really hurt. Like, I remember,
Yeah.
I can't
Yeah.
believe I'm saying this out loud, but I gave my first TED talk, and my, you know, parents, when I told them and I shared the video, and they were like, yeah, you shaved your beard really, really like light. And I was
Yes.
just like, is this the first comment
Of
that could
course it
come
is.
from like a TED talk?
Of course
But,
it is.
you know, it really hurt. And I'm just like, but I can never, like, this is the first time I'm sharing that, but I've
Mm,
never been able to say that to them. I've never been able to be like, but why? I
yeah.
don't know. Have you ever then closed the loop with them, or is this just something that, you know, you just carry with you?
Yeah. So yes, yes, yes. I mean, it's not a one-time conversation, right? Like I have definitely had moments when I've had to have this conversation with my parents about specific things. My parents would be horrified that I'm telling you this, but it sounds like we're just going there.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just going to put it all on the internet today.
Mm-hmm.
There was an incident when I was a teenager where I got caught doing something. I'll just say it vaguely, you know, that I shouldn't have been doing. And
Mm-hmm.
my parents, my mom, punished me pretty extremely.
Mm-hmm.
Like she didn't let me get my driver's license on
Wow.
time for she delayed it by a year. I was like not allowed to go anywhere. Like I was on lockdown. I didn't have
Mm-hmm.
access to email. Like it was a very extreme,
Mm-hmm.
intense punishment, and I think very oversized for what I had done.
Mm-hmm.
I still believe that, and that really the saddest thing about that was that it changed my relationship with my mom. Like when I was a kid, my mom would like, you know, she'd be like, I'm going grocery shopping, and like it was me, and then my sister is a year and a half older, my brother is a year and a half younger, so we're kind of like this little pod, and they would like, we're gonna stay home and watch TV, we're gonna watch cartoons, or we're gonna, you know, play the Nintendo. But I would be like, oh, Ami, can I come with you? Like I would love just going everywhere with her. I just followed her around. We'd go on these errands, whatever. I was so close to her. You know, she was kind of like my safety. And you know, these are things I realized by doing therapy. Like, you know, she kept me safe kind of in this like new environment, and I really needed that. But then as a teenager, it was like things flipped because suddenly she felt like I was, you know, rebelling in ways she didn't like. She was afraid. I think ultimately she was afraid like I would have sex and get knocked up, right? Ultimately, maybe that was the fear in her head. I was so far from that. I just told you, like, you know, I was a total nerd. I like didn't think anybody in school liked me. Like, I'm sure they didn't. I was
Yeah.
overweight. I was awkward. I had braces. I had facial hair. Like, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
it wasn't happening. And like,
Mm-hmm.
it really hurt me that she couldn't see that she couldn't see like one that you know the prospects were there, but also that I wasn't going to do that. I was like,
Yeah.
you have to trust me. You
Mm-hmm.
raised me a certain way. Like, why can't you trust me, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so that really hurt our relationship. And when I was like in college or maybe a little bit after, my brother kind of like there was a moment where he was like, you guys really need to talk about this, like you need to have a sort of a sit down. And so we did, and I told her most of that and whatever way I had thought about it at that point. And she apologized profusely, actually. And I have a youngest brother who is 12 years younger than me, so he's in his 20s now, and he's been raised very differently than the older set in the house. My mom has given him a lot more flexibility and like leeway, and he's now engaged to somebody who is Azerbaijani, and like
Oh, wow.
that's like something I would never, have been allowed to do. Bilal is very much my husband. Bilal is very much a Pakistani,
Yeah.
but she changed. And then she said to me, I was like, well, what's up with like Jawad getting all these like, rights? And
Uh-huh.
she's like, I changed, and so like, God bless her. Like you said, your parents are amazing human beings. My parents are amazing human beings. My
Yeah.
parents, what they did in that generation, like, and we can talk about like Pakistan history. Like, imagine my dad was born in 45. Like the country was created 2 years after he was born. In the Punjab, my parents were really kind of on the fault lines. My mom remembers the 65 war. Like there was shelling
Wow.
in Sialkot, which is where she's from. I have a little bit of a partition story about like, memory that my mom had that's been passed down from her siblings. They lived through a very chaotic moment. They didn't know what their futures were going to look like. Can you imagine if we were like, in our teenage years and America had just been created, or like
Yeah.
whatever place
Yeah.
you were like, it was just created. You have no idea what's happening. There's immediate war with your neighbor. You don't have like resources. You don't know what the job prospects are. You don't know
Yeah.
what your future. Okay. And so now you're like, okay, maybe I'll go to this other place, America. It looks more secure. And you get here and you don't know the language and you experience racism, you experience discrimination. They were up against so much. Like, it's actually miraculous what they did for us. All my siblings and I are college educated. We all have careers. Like, bless them for like the opportunities they gave us. Like, really, I cannot say that enough. I forgive everything. And I think like in the realm of like possibilities of things that could have gone wrong, I had a great, great upbringing.
Yeah. That's beautiful. Sometimes I wonder if our children will be as forgiving with us as we are with our parents, but we'll come
Probably
to
not, because they'll be like
that.
American brats. So they're like, Mom, you're the worst.
It's gonna be
I
different.
feel like I already get that from them.
Maybe our parents did something right. No.
Yeah. Yeah.
Cool. So then talk to me a little bit about sort of undergrad. Where did you go? Were you close to family when you went to school? And then I'm assuming you met Bilal in those years, your Bilal. So talk to us a little bit about sort of that journey and what that was like.
Yeah. So I guess you've picked up on a pattern. My parents did not want my sister or I leaving the house to go to college. So my sister, who was a year ahead of me in school, applied to a bunch of schools. She applied everywhere, and she got into some really great universities. We were living in Seattle at the time. We had moved while I was in high school from San Jose to Seattle. And my parents were like, no, you're going to go to the University of Washington and you're going to commute. We live like a 45-minute bus ride away. You're going to take the bus. You're going to come home every night. And she was crushed. Like she, was really defeated. And so it came my turn to apply, and I had really good grades. I had like great like AP scores and stuff. I was the valedictorian, and my dad was like, Ambreen, apply to Harvard. He was like,
Ooh.
please. He was just like, give me like my dream, give me like a child. And I was like, this will give you a sense of my personality. I was like, no. I was like,
Oh.
I am not applying to Harvard because you didn't let Eliza go anywhere. And
Oh, wow.
and if I get in, I don't even know that you're going to let me go, or if you're just going to frame the acceptance and send me to UW. So no. And I didn't. I only applied to the University of Washington, which was very easy for me to get into. So it was actually like I'm thankful that I made that decision, because I didn't have that stress of college admissions. Like I totally missed that window of like, that experience a lot of kids have. So it was great. I got early acceptance. I got a full ride. Like they were like, you want to go to the business school? Come into the business school. They were just so like rolling out the red carpet for me. And I was like, yep, this is what I'm going to do. I'm just going
Can
to
I
go do
just
it.
stop you here and say it's so cute how like good, decent human beings, like the two of us, rebel if I do take the liberty of calling us good, decent human beings. Like it's so interesting that your idea of rebellion was this. I remember like when I was a kid and my mom used to be like namaz pado, and I wanted to pray, but I didn't want to pray because she was telling me to do it. So in front of her, I wouldn't pray, and I would go hide in my room and pray to make
Oh,
sure that she thought that I wasn't praying. And then I mean,
that's so
it
cute
just
because you wanted to do it for yourself. I feel like that's
yeah.
so
And I was
heartfelt.
like, that's just so like to do it for your sister and to say, it's just so, and it's sometimes it's just it's self-damaging as well. We'll come to whether you
Yeah.
regretted that decision later, but I guess you met Bilal, so maybe not. But it's so interesting how we do such weird things like for no like this is where like the unexpected effects of the weird relationships that we
Yeah,
have with our parents
you're
is just
right.
so
You're right. And it was self-damaging. It was kind of like, let me hurt myself to hurt you. I don't think I would have gotten to Harvard, but I probably could have I really wanted to go to UC Berkeley and I'd grown up in the
hmm
Bay Area. I probably like could have had a shot at getting in and maybe that would have been a different life. But actually my college, and I met Bilal after college, not at
okay.
college. So I'll tell you that story separately. But I loved going to the University of Washington. I have no regrets. And the thing is, when
Okay.
I mentioned my younger brother, who was 12 years younger. So when I was going to college, he was like 4 or 5. And
hmm
I was really close to him. So I didn't actually want to leave the house. I didn't want to miss out on his childhood. I'm sort of like sister mother. I think my sister and
hmm
I are both that way with him. And I loved him so much. And like, I knew I wanted to become a mom. I now have 3 kids of my own because of that experience. So that's something I think, again, like American culture versus Pakistani culture. Like, in American culture, it's all about the individual and cultivating the individual. And the idea that like you want to get out of your house and become your own person is like what you're supposed to be feeling when you finish high school. But I also wanted to be with my family, and in
hmm
Pakistani culture, for
yeah.
anybody who doesn't know who's listening, like sometimes people live with their family their whole lives, right? And
hmm
so often that's the case. And there's nothing wrong with like staying in your family home. And so in a way, like I wanted that comfort. I think I was also doing it for myself. Maybe I was afraid of failure. Maybe I was afraid of, going out and facing the world at that point. But UW was so fun. Like I met tons of Pakistanis there. I got super involved in the PSA. I will tell you, like, so I started college in September 11, like September
Mm.
2001. Like 9/11 happened two
Wow.
weeks before we started. So that is the whole experience. And like
hmm
it is a huge can of worms that, I'm still trying to kind of think about. But, I got involved with the MSA initially, and then I found the MSA to be quite rigid. We had a very
hmm
conservative MSA, like all the guys looking at
mm
the floor, don't make eye contact with you.
hmm
I was in
hmm
business school. I was doing a finance degree. I was really good at numbers.
Wow.
And
hmm
the, MSA vice president told me that I was like going into this haram career because interest was haram. And
Wow.
how had I not known that?
hmm
My parents were like religious,
hmm
praying, going to the masjid,
hmm
everything, but they weren't rigid like that.
hmm
They didn't get
hmm
into the like, I don't
hmm
know, like I had
Yeah.
literally never even heard about this thing about interest until I got to
hmm
college. So there definitely were
hmm
gaps in my kind of
hmm
understanding of Islam. And my parents come from as this part of Pakistan where there's a lot of Sufi influence.
Yeah.
Both my families are Sunni, but my dad is actually practicing Shia today, and he became
Oh
Shia
wow.
when he came here. I think like the Shia masjid spoke to him more because his
hmm
mom was very like, involved in. I guess members of her family would go to like Lucknow and like study, and there was this like tradition of like loving the Prophet's family, and like that's very much a part of like how people
hmm
practice Islam in Punjab, or at least used to, right before the
hmm
Wahhabi influence became stronger. So it was a different kind of Islam, and I was so insecure, and I'm coming into the MSA and I'm like, oh, like I'm not a good Muslim. I don't know what
Yeah.
Islam is or whatever. So eventually I kind of distanced myself a little bit. I was involved, but less so. And then the PSA became like my home, the Pakistani
Wow.
Students Association.
hmm
And it was so fun. There were
hmm
tons of students at UW who were from Pakistan, international
hmm
students. It really kind of like, I felt like I found my people for the
Oh
first
wow.
time, because I had been struggling so much with this like divided identity. And then suddenly it was okay to be Desi and it was okay to be American and it was okay to be in college and just like have both those things. And surprisingly, all of a sudden it was okay with my parents that like I was hanging out with Pakistani boys. Like very interesting.
As
Suddenly the
long as they
rules
were
changed.
Pakistani. Okay.
Yeah, it's funny how things change, and I had a great experience. I would never take it back. I loved going to a big state school. I love that. I would love that for my kids too. I think,
Hmm.
we get so obsessed with like college rankings, and
Hmm.
I did just fine, with my state university degree.
That's amazing. On the PSA part, and for those who might not know, that's the Pakistan Student Association. Could you feel the difference between Pakistanis who came from Pakistan and Pakistanis like you who had grown up here, like and who you got along with more?
I mean, let me say that like the Pakistanis who were like super assimilated probably weren't in
Hmm.
the PSA, right? So if
Ah.
you were in the PSA, you were the kind of Pakistani American kid who grew up in touch with your Pakistani identity.
Hmm.
So yeah, you could feel the difference because the international students were like just they were struggling in the ways that my parents
Yeah.
struggled when we first came here to understand American culture, right? And they were
Hmm.
awkward and all that. But we felt a great affinity. We all hung out together, and we had a
Hmm.
great group of friends. And we really I loved it because they were a touch point for me. It's like they had brought this culture to my front door, and I loved it. Like we used to listen to like Janoon, and there were like Janoon concerts back then in Seattle, and Atif Aslam became big. Like all those things, like my memories of college are so good. And then at that time, there was also something called the South Asian Students
Hmm.
Association. I don't
Uh-huh.
think it exists anymore, but so there was the ISA for the Indians and the PSA for the Pakistanis, and then there was the South Asian Students Association.
Yeah.
These were the kids who were like, guys, like, why are we divided? Like, let's just all be one group. And they would throw these fun dance parties. DJ Rekha became really big in those
Uh-huh.
years, and like would do like bhangra and stuff. And like I just like I felt like all of it was suddenly okay. Like being the kid who was like not allowed to go to school dances, like suddenly really enjoying my Pakistani culture through those environments. Like it was just like everything that I needed. So yeah.
Wow. Fascinating. All right. Now take us to post sort of undergrad life.
Yeah.
And walk us both like what's happening from your career side and then where Bilal comes into the picture.
Yeah. So one thing I didn't tell you about my dad is that he's actually kind of like a 70s hippie, like
Mm.
in his
Mm-hmm.
feelings. Like I feel like he would have been like living in San Francisco, like smoking weed if he had the
Mm-hmm.
option, if that was where he had landed at that time in his life. So
Uh-huh.
he's very like anti-capitalist, and
Mm.
he's very political, and
Mm-hmm.
so that really, I mean, he's the one who told me to go to business school, and he ran a
Mm-hmm.
business when I was younger. He had me very involved in it. He would make me do all sorts of tasks for him when I was younger. And he saw that I had a knack for it. But by the time I was graduating, I was looking at jobs in like banking or consulting, and I realized that no, like this is not what I'm going to do with my life. I didn't come, my parents didn't bring me here, and like I didn't like have this like crazy like whirlwind cultural experience
Yeah.
just to turn around and like go work at a bank and help people make money. Like I just couldn't do it. So I had a
Mm-hmm.
bit of a panic attack right before I graduated. I tried to switch degrees. I thought I wanted to maybe do it, like become a history teacher, but I had too
Mm.
many credits. So I had to graduate. So I did. And then I applied for like Teach for America, AmeriCorps,
Mm-hmm.
that kind of stuff. And I thought, okay, let me just like work for a nonprofit. Sounds like I want to do something with like mission oriented. And I started working for like an after school tutoring program in kind of the low income neighborhoods of Seattle. Basically,
Mm-hmm.
for the first year, I was like a program assistant. It was like an office job, but it was for a nonprofit. And so that's kind of where I was sitting. And I was like, feeling like, okay, I lived at home when I was in college. Now I'm done with college. I'm still living at home. And I was starting to get really antsy. Seattle felt like a very small place. I wanted something more. With Teach for America, I was hoping to maybe go teach in like California. And my parents were like really nervous about me like going to teach in kind of inner city schools. So they didn't want me to do it. Then I found this program. My cousin sent it to me called Impact. And
Mm.
Impact was a brand new like startup nonprofit that was basically like a Peace Corps, but like
Mm-hmm.
a Peace Corps program in Pakistan.
Yeah.
Peace Corps had pulled out of Pakistan many years prior, just because it was unstable. And so it was like a summer, like come live in Karachi with a group of Pakistanis and work for an NGO. And I was like, I'm going to do this. Like, then my parents are not going to turn down me going to Pakistan. They're going to see it as super safe. They're going to finally let me out of the house. So I applied and I got in. And sure enough, my parents were like, okay, you can go live in Karachi for the summer. Like, clearly you want to get out of here. Like, this is okay.
I felt comfortable applying to go to Karachi, but not to Howard. Keep going.
Exactly. And that program was founded by three people, one of whom was Bilal, my husband. So that's how I met him. I met him in Karachi at the airport. Like, that's where we saw each other for the first time. And, in the months before, like, I was in touch with him a lot. And now I know that he was sort of interested in me and I was sort of interested in him. I remember just being like, who's this, like, Pakistani guy that wants to change the world, right? Like, that doesn't happen that often. So I was already, like, very curious about, like, he decided to, like, create this program so people could work for NGOs. He wasn't just like out there trying to get like a big job and make a lot of money like every single like a good Pakistani immigrants were trying to do. So I was very curious about him, and I remember I told you I'm 5'10", so I remember thinking like, okay, when I see him, if he's taller than me, then this can go forward. So like I land at the airport, like he's there to receive the group or whatever, and he's like 6 feet tall, and I was like, okay. It's on.
It's meant to be. Wow.
That was a very cool program. It was like real world in Pakistan. There were 15 of us. They were like 11 of us were Americans, the others were British. We were all like diaspora Pakistanis of various kinds, and we were living in this house in this conservative, like, we were in, I think, defense, and we were like American kids in a way. Like, we're like walking on the streets, doing whatever we want, like feeling like full license to be there, but in Pakistan. So it was really a fun experience.
That's awesome. And, you've told me about Bilal. For some reason, I thought that Bilal had also grown up here, because I thought, like, given how interesting your story is and how much identity has been a part, that's really interesting. We need to get into that about how
he did grow up here.
Oh, he did grow up here. Okay, so
I just hadn't met him.
So tell me his story a little bit.
So he was, again, a big migration story. He was born in Germany because his dad was working there. His dad worked in oil and gas, so he moved around a lot, and so he ultimately settled in Houston, and that's where he grew up. He went to school in Georgia and was in DC by the time he launched Impact. He's 4 years older than me, so he was like 25, I guess. But he, I was telling you earlier about like there were the Pakistanis who went back often. Like, he had a very different experience. His dad was moving around the world for his job. He had a good job in oil and gas. He was an engineer. They went back to Pakistan all the time. He's Urdu speaking. They were in Karachi. So it's such a different, as the years have gone on, I've realized, like, we are so different. At the time, I was like, we're both Pakistani. It's the same thing, it's my own ignorance. But totally different, but very American, much more American than me. My Urdu is far better than his.
Okay. I'm very excited to meet Bilal. I'm actually meeting Bilal next week, and I'm very excited to see him as well. But when you were in Pakistan, so, when you were growing up as a kid here, you were like, okay, I'm, still figuring out what it means to be an American sort of with a Pakistani heritage. When you went back to Pakistan, did you feel Pakistani, or did you feel less Pakistani when you interacted with people who were local? Like, how was that impact? Or at that point in time, were you so young and having so much fun it didn't matter, like, whether you were more Pakistani, more American in that moment?
It mattered a lot. I mean, I mentioned that, 9/11 had just happened when I started college. So after 9/11, I felt like I wasn't American. I felt like that's what Americans were telling me, the whole, like, either you're with us or against us. When George Bush said that, in my mind, I thought, like, you're bombing Afghani, like, villages. Like, I think maybe I'm with them because my cousins live over there. Like, they don't live that far from there. Pakistan is, like, being wreaking, like, havoc is wreaking there because of this war. So I didn't feel very American. I felt very upset about the war. I felt like it was an attack on me and my people. And so I went to Pakistan. Like I mentioned, we went on this family trip right when I graduated. So this was the year before Impact. I was there with my family, and I felt like this is my place. I should move back to Pakistan.
Oh, wow.
So even doing impact was kind of my way of coming back and seeing like, okay, could I be here? Like, could I be here outside of the family context? You know, you go with your family, you stay with your family, you don't really get to like feel, can you do it? And I wanted to understand that. And for years after impact, I traveled back to Pakistan every year on my own. I did a lot of like journalism work there, and then ultimately when I was in journalism school, I also went to India and I lived in India for 4 months. So that part of my life, I was very much South Asia oriented, and my identity, I felt very Pakistani when I was there. And my cousins and my family, they were like, welcome home. Like, yeah, you're Pakistani. They were like, what are you crazy people doing living in America? Like, they totally, they never said like, oh, you're American, or like hazed me for that. They were very impressed at like how like much I wanted to integrate into Pakistani culture. And I mentioned like my mom called me a chameleon. Like, I picked up Urdu and Punjabi very quickly. You know, I loved the fashion. I felt like, I told you, like, I was very uncomfortable in my body. Like, I felt like wearing shalwar kameez was like what my body was meant to wear. I felt very comfortable in it. You know, it's like, it's like the right clothing for my physique as a, like a Desi woman. Like, I don't even know how to explain it, but I bet a lot of your female listeners would like understand. It's just, I felt like, oh yeah, this is where like I was meant to be. And like, I've been living in the wrong place. Yeah.
Wow. That's fascinating. I was gonna make a joke. I don't know if it's appropriate or not, but I'm like, you wanted to move back to Pakistan. You didn't move back to Pakistan, but you ended up marrying Bilal, which I think was a close way of saying, how close can I get to this?
You might be
Uh,
right about that. I mean, that's like some good psychoanalysis.
I'm like, how can I keep this feeling going? But
Yeah.
all right, I want to come back to your career now. So, walk me through how you went after that experience with a finance degree and then pivoted into journalism as your calling. How did that happen?
Yeah. So when I was in Karachi, my placement, each of us was working for a different nonprofit. Mine was with the Citizens Foundation, which
Oh,
is the
wow.
largest education institution that, isn't public in
Hmm.
Pakistan. They build schools and then they run them like basically from brick to like, they run all of it, like the actual school infrastructure, but then also the teaching and the education and everything. It's a really cool nonprofit, with a huge kind of impact here in the US. A lot of people support it from here. So I worked for TCF, and I was basically tasked with teaching in their summer school at a school that is like an hour outside of Karachi in kind of this industrial part of the city, kind of a slum basically. And so I would meet at, go to the TCF office in the morning, and I'd take a TCF bus out there, and then I would go out there, and these kids who are living in very like simple, situation, their parents work in this factory, are there for summer school, and I'm teaching them English and computer classes. It was sort of absurd because like I didn't know how to do those things, but I spent, whatever, a month and a half with these kids, and they were just incredible, like incredible human beings. It was just, yeah, it was something else to like really see what their lives were like and to really kind of engage with. They were all people who were graduating, so they were about to go into, whatever was going to be the next thing. There was no next class at TCF that they could go into. They could go to college, but a lot of the girls were not going to go to college. And one of them was very, very bright, and her name was Shagufta, and she was a good like English speaker, and she just kind of like, she came in one day and she's like, Miss, it's my birthday and I wrote a poem and I'd like to read it. And she read the poem out loud, and the poem I still have is basically, she's talked about how she has all these dreams and wishes. She wants to fly like a butterfly, she wants to be free, and yet she knows that all these wishes will just go with her to the next birthday, that like they won't be fulfilled. Yeah, I was crushed. It was like she saw her life so clearly, and I had no better answer for her than, you're right. And I met her parents. I went to her house, like walked literally, in like the slum, just walked into the like little box that
Mm-hmm.
they lived in. I don't even know how to describe it to somebody who hasn't
Yeah.
been, in that environment, but you know what I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And,
Mm-hmm.
lifted the chadar and there's their house. And the parents, greeted me. And of course, they want me to have a cold drink and they want me to eat.
Yeah.
And like the hospitality is insane.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just like obvious to me that, yeah, like they're not going to give her an education. Like,
Mm-hmm.
it, it's not their fault. Like they can't
Yeah.
give her an education, and it
Mm-hmm.
makes no sense. Like they're going to
Mm-hmm.
marry her off, and she's going to be a mother, and that's her life.
Mm-hmm.
And it
Mm-hmm.
impacted me so deeply, and I decided to write something about it, just to share with like my colleagues at Impact. And so I just like, wrote my thoughts. I shared what I was doing for the summer. I talked about what was happening, and I included her poem. And one of the other co-founders, Mustafa, he was like, this is pretty good. I wonder if I could ask somebody. He was from the UK. Like, he's like, I know
Mm-hmm.
this like publication there. Could I ask them to publish it?
Yeah.
And it's that like light bulb moment, like
Mm.
I had written for my high school paper, I had written for my college paper. Oh, it's a hobby, like, I'm not
Yeah.
gonna, never even thought like journalism was a career option, because my parents were like,
Mm-hmm.
doctor, businessman, like they were like, here are your
Mm-hmm.
choices. And when he published it and I saw it published, I thought maybe like by getting her message out, it makes a difference,
Mm-hmm.
and I thought maybe this is how I make a difference in the world, is I help get the message out for all these people that I'm seeing that like people don't know a lot about. Nobody knew that
Mm-hmm.
much about Pakistan then, and maybe even today. And so that was like, okay, I'm gonna become a journalist. And so I came back to the States. I got a job in communications, because that's kind of what I could do at that point,
Mm-hmm.
at a nonprofit in DC. I came home and I was like way more confident. I was like, Mom, Dad, I'm moving. I'm leaving the nest. This is official. I got
Mm-hmm.
a job. I'm going to Washington, D.C. Most of the people in
Wow.
the program were from D.C., and they were telling me,
Mm-hmm.
like, if this is the kind of work you want to do, you should move to D.C. That's the
Yeah.
place to be. A lot of Muslims had gone there post 9/11.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I did. I got this job, and then I worked in this nonprofit for a year, doing like writing their journals and stuff. But then I applied for journalism school, and the following year I went to Northwestern and started my career as a journalist.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's, you can't, what a story. Like, from the poem of a little girl to where you sort of take your journalism now, from how so many things have shaped that, and the stories that you got to tell because you saw a story that you want to tell. It's quite
As you say
remarkable.
that, I realized like I always thought about getting her message out to other people, but the greatest impact she had was on me.
Yeah.
She changed my life with her poem.
I mean, it just blows your mind, right? Like, she could have
Yeah.
never, I mean, in some poetic way, her poem was about not being able to achieve her dreams, but she gave you a dream that you didn't even know you had. And you lived that poem out. Like, it's sort of strange at so many different levels.
Honestly, that kind of breaks my heart a little bit though, because she also deserves to have her
Yeah.
dreams be fulfilled, and I hope that she did, right? Like,
Yeah.
that's sad that if her poem enabled me but not her.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
And that's the crazy part about the experiences that we have. Yeah. I wanna sort of take this to sort of one of the other unexpected outcomes of that journey that you've been on, which is the Central Desi newsletter. Again, one of the unexpected pathways that journey took you on. Talk to us about, how that came about, and the journey that it took you to sort of get to say, hey, I want to cover South Asian stories in
Yeah.
Jersey. Like, talk to us about that arc.
Well, I should mention that between that moment and the Central Desi newsletter, there's 15 years. And
Mm-hmm.
when I launched Central Desi, which is a newsletter that I write about the South Asian community in New Jersey, which is where I've been living for the last 5 years, and is going to be our home. We bought a house here and raising our kids here. When I launched a newsletter and shared it on social, I actually shared Shagufta's poem. So it very
Wow.
much was like connected to that origin story, because that's the reason I went to journalism school. But then I got to journalism school and I got into the business of figuring out how I could make a living as a journalist, right? So, I was able to go to India when I was at Northwestern. That was so cool. I got to intern for AFP, so I got to do reporting in Delhi and Mumbai, and then I got to travel, and it was just an incredible experience. But then I came back and I was like, okay, I got to get a job, right? So I got a job as a reporter, congressional reporter in DC. I was covering, energy, I think, and like tech at some point, just covering congressional hearings. You start becoming like, when you go into DC, you have like everybody kind of arrives with these grand plans, and then you become like a little ant in this like giant kingdom, and you're just like doing this one job, and you kind of can lose sight of like why you're there, right? Like I'm not at this point like writing stories advocating for the Pakistani community anymore. I'm just like writing about congressional hearings and chasing senators or whatever. And I did that for a few years, and then we decided to have a baby. I was married at this point, so we decided to have our first child. I had my son Sufyan, and I took like I think 6 months of leave, and then having him was, for me, like, if you don't mind me kind of going off a little trajectory for a minute, it was also another one of those moments where like I felt like my Indian and Pakistani cultures were clashing, because my mom was a very Pakistani mom, and by that I mean her entire heart was like poured into us in every way. She was just like give, 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 so like selfless. There are no limits or boundaries on this love. And I thought, okay, like, yeah, that felt really good. That's the kind of mom I want to be. So I wanted to be that kind of mom. But then I had this career as a congressional reporter, and so I had to go back to work. And so I hired a nanny, and Sufi, as I call him, like he wouldn't take a bottle. He was nursing and he didn't take a bottle. So while I was at work, he wouldn't like have any milk, and he was like a 6-month-old. So you can see, like, I'm sitting there in the press room of the Capitol building, and I'm just texting the nanny, and I'm just like pumping in bathrooms in between hearings, and my heart is not in this job anymore. And all I want to do is go home and hold that child, right? And I was very emotional about it, but I just decided to quit. I quit this incredible job, incredible opportunity. I talked to a couple of my coworkers who were older women. One of them had taken time off, and then had returned after her daughter was older. And she told me I would never regret it, and that I would always be able to come back to it, and that I should just do it. So I did. I quit, and I was like, I guess I'll be a freelance writer. So back to the career, I became this freelance journalist, and I kind of did that part-time as I was having my kids, and I felt very insecure. Like I felt like I'd abandoned my career. I felt like I was very lost in the, like, do I be a mom or do I become, like a career person? How do I reconcile these two? What is the right thing? My mom was like, you have to stay home with your kids. She's like, this is what you're supposed to do. It was like, yeah, but then why did you send me to school? Like, why, like Shagufta, why did you let me dream? And now you're like, no, this is not what you're supposed to do. I really wrestled with it for maybe a decade, but in sort of an accidental way, the freelance career was incredible because it allowed me to really pitch stories I wanted to write. So I started writing, in addition to the, like lots of business and tech and policy stories and stuff. And I also started writing like more personal things. So I think the first one was we went to Pakistan, and I noticed at this point, this is 5 years ago, Uber and Careem are really big. There's ride sharing in Pakistan. And I hadn't been to Pakistan in so long. And like all of a sudden, it just felt like a different place. It had modernized. Lahore had they had redone their like freeway system and basically hidden all the slums. I mean, it's really problematic. They'd built that giant mall packages, and so I was looking at this society like, hey, everything has changed. Like, I used to come to Pakistan to escape kind of Western culture and feel at home here, but Western culture has arrived here. Like all my cousins are on Instagram, and like the Pakistan I knew felt like it was gone a little bit. And I pitched a story about how Uber and Careem was like kind of giving women in Pakistan so much freedom, because in the past, my cousins, they would have to like ask for the family car, or they would have to wait for somebody to be free. Like you couldn't just like go on the street and get a rickshaw if you were a girl in Lahore. It wasn't considered safe for like women of whatever class level. Obviously, women are traveling if they have to on buses or whatever, right? But like on a certain class level, they're like, oh, it's not safe. And so all of a sudden they're like, oh, we'll just call a Kareem and then we can go to the mall, you know? And it's like, oh, okay. Like, so it ended up being a really cool feature story about how, you know, this technological advancement was actually shifting society for women in Pakistan. And I got to interview the first female motorcycle driver for Kareem. And it was so cool talking to her. She was like such a badass. And she was like, well, I put my helmet on. Nobody knows I'm a woman, you know? It was very fun. And that kind of lit a fire in me. Like it got me back a little bit to, oh yeah, I was supposed to do this journalism thing so I could talk about this like experience, right? I pitched a couple more like personal essays to the Washington Post. I wrote one about Dawat culture. And like when I was growing up, me and all my friends had this shared memory of like our parents throwing these epic Dawats. Like they would invite 100 people to their 4-bedroom house and somehow everybody would eat dinner. And like my mom would be cooking for 3 days and then somebody else would do it the next weekend, right? And this was kind of what we did growing up. And kids would play in the basement, and then, you know, at some time of night, like 2 a.m, like they would get in the car. Parents were not thinking about bedtimes. It was so different than how I was parenting. And I started thinking about that, and I was like, I don't think my kids are going to experience dawats like during Ramadan. If it was like iftar time, I wouldn't take my kids because it was after bedtime, you know? So I started to wonder about that, and I pitched a story to the Post, like their on parenting section, and they were happy to take it. So I got to interview like other South Asians, and we talked about what it means like to kind of raise kids in a community versus in like the very nuclear way that we raise it. It was very fun to do, and I did another piece after that, kind of in similar vein. I started getting into this pattern of writing these personal essays for the Post, and I did a couple, one for the LA Times as well. And then I felt like unfulfilled. I was like, I'm putting these ideas out there, and then I'm not having a conversation with my community about them. I want to talk to them about it. I don't want to just like publish this thing. And I also don't want to be in the business of explaining myself to white people. That's not what I'm interested in, you know, and you have to like know that media has evolved so much in the course of my career. So like really where we are now in media is like one-to-one conversations, right? Like this is kind of what the level of depth we can get into in this conversation. Like no Washington Post article can ever replicate that experience. And so that's where Central Desi came from. You know, I was living in New Jersey. The only thing I knew about New Jersey before I came here was Edison. There's lots of Desis, right? And there are lots of Desis here. But consuming the news here, I realized that like actually a lot of the newspapers don't write that much about the Desi community. And I would pitch stories. Like I wanted to pitch a story about this. I was thinking about how like there was a restaurant in the town I used to live in, South Orange, which isn't too far from you, but also you probably know it. There's a place called Jackie and Sons. And Jackie and Son is a restaurant by a woman whose parents had a restaurant. I think she's Arab, and they had kind of a first generation, you know, they were in the restaurant business. Lots of immigrants come here and they're in the restaurant business. But she created this very innovative new restaurant concept, and it's kind of like pulling from her heritage. There's a lot of like, there's like labneh on the menu and a lot of Middle Eastern food. So I was thinking, you know, there's a second generation of restaurateurs that are like kind of the assimilated generation, the children of the ones, they know the restaurant business and now they're starting these cool ventures. I thought it was going to be a great story. And I'm trying to sell it to New Jersey Monthly Magazine or whatever it's called. And they're like, oh, yeah, no, we've already done a story like that before. You know, we've kind of covered this community. We've done. And I was just like feeling like I was hitting it up against these gatekeepers. Like I knew there were a lot of rich stories to be told in this community because I could see them. But New Jersey is actually such a segregated state in a way because people don't really, like the Desi community feels, I think, a little bit unapproachable to people who are not in it. And there are a lot of, you know, the community is also insular and protective. There's a lot of people who have come here. There's like kind of, this is the first generation. So they have their own reasons as well. But I don't know if you know this, New Jersey had like hate crimes in the 80s and maybe even the 90s. There's a gang of white supremacists called the Dot Busters. And they were coming
Wow.
after like Indians here. So there's a history of discrimination and fear and distrust
Hmm.
that leads to the community being insular. But
Hmm.
I felt like what a loss. Like in terms of the national, like, where the Desis are in the country,
Hmm.
it's like New York area, Chicago, Houston, Bay Area. These are our big hubs, right?
Hmm.
Like these hubs should be telling really cool stories about the diaspora and what it's like. What is this experience like we're all having where we're assimilating? And so that's kind of what I wanted to do with Central Desi. I'm very, very much in the beginning phases. It's so hard to do something like this solo. I'm sure you and I can
Hmm.
commiserate on that with kids and other responsibilities, but I can't let go of the idea because I think it's an important one. I think we need to bring voice to all communities, right?
Absolutely. No, um, I find the need for this um, so personally and at such a human level. Like that's why I'm kind of starting this podcast because I crave this community around me and to be able to have those conversations. And it's at two levels. One is like, more on the identity part, which is more of my own self journey or exploration that I'm going through, which is why sort of this podcast is there. But more at a human level, I've moved to Jersey sort of in my current home like 8 months ago, and I don't have a community. Like I don't know who the Desi is, and the insular community. It's interesting that you point out the insular part and trace the history. I didn't have some of this idea about this gang and sort of some of the other sort of systemic issues that were relevant to Jersey. But for me, as somebody who's just moved, I'm like, the community is so insular that I don't know how to break into it, even though I'm Desi and the community is Desi. But
Yeah.
I'm like, how do I make a friend? And then how do I make a friend who has the same values when I don't know my own values? I'm still figuring my own identity and values out. Like how do I size someone else up and be like, and now you have a kid, it's not just you, but your wife needs to like the person, and your kid needs to like the person's
Yeah.
kid. And you're just like, how am I supposed to make all these things sort of work out? And so I think we need that. And I'm so happy that you did that. And that's how we met each other as well.
Yeah.
Like I read about Central Desi. I'm like, I need to know Ambreen. And then I stalked you across two panels, and I'm like, we need to talk. And but that's what community feels, and it shouldn't be this hard. Like I think if we're able to do more of this and make it easier for other people, it'll be it'll be
Yeah.
more like it'll be on the surface
Yeah.
and easier to get through. So I'm so happy that you're doing this.
Thank you. And I the thing with New Jersey is like basically New Jersey is a giant suburb of
Mm-hmm.
New York and
Mm-hmm.
eventually Philadelphia. If you get to the bottom, there's a little bit of farmland. I don't want to dismiss that, but basically this is a suburb. And
Mm-hmm.
what happens is that people who are cool and interesting and creative and want to do fun things that grow up here, they move to New York City. They move to
Mm-hmm.
Brooklyn. They get closer to the
Mm-hmm.
city. And all the fun, interesting cultural things, the ways that you would
Yeah.
naturally meet people
Mm-hmm.
happen in the city. That's kind of,
Mm-hmm.
it just sucks everybody up in that direction.
Yeah.
But, people like you and me,
Mm-hmm.
got the spouse, got the children, need to kind of settle down, looking for a good place to raise a family. I think we're calling out to each other a little bit, and thank God for, digital like
Yeah.
connection, because you're right, that's how we found each other. But I think that's going to happen more and more. And, with one of my things with Central Desi is I really want to host kind of some gatherings and events that are in person in New Jersey, like create some of those like exciting
Yeah.
hubs that people can gather around. There's this community, I think it started in San Francisco, called Subcontinental Drift, and they host
Mm.
these night, kind of like open mic nights, and
Okay.
for the Desi people, and
Mm-hmm.
it's in different cities. And so
Mm-hmm.
when I was in Seattle briefly before I came to New Jersey, Bilal and I were there. We were trying it out to see if we could live in Seattle, and he's not a West Coast guy. But we were there for a couple of years, so we launched Subcontinental Drift in Seattle. And Seattle is also very similar to New Jersey. It's hard to meet people. There's
Mm-hmm.
there is a sizable Desi community now, but still kind of hard to access. People have that, they call it the Seattle freeze.
Mm-hmm.
People just aren't very friendly. I don't think that's true. It's just when people
Mm-hmm.
already grow up with each other and
Mm-hmm.
have like their own, they're not searching for social
Yeah.
networks. They already have them. So
Mm-hmm.
we did this like open mic night, and so like people came, performed. Some people danced, some people did like various kinds of skits or like performances, spoken word, that kind of stuff. And it was really fun. We had like, 50 brown people together in this like little venue. And afterwards, everyone was just like so lit up and excited about it. Like, oh, this is so great. Thank you for creating this.
Yeah.
There's something about that in-person connection that people really love. So I want to bring that to New Jersey. And I feel like, yeah, we can absolutely find people who want to do it. Maybe you and I should team up and try to create
Yeah.
it. But I hear you, like my journey of like living in so many different places and like not feeling rooted. I want to have a community around me. I want to have like the ability to throw davats, and I also am very
Yeah.
much missing community. I think maybe we all are right now. Like maybe this is like a moment, not even just for Desis, like Americans in general, maybe the whole world. Like we all need to kind of figure out how we're going to do community in this new structure because it's not the same structure as our parents
Yeah.
had.
For sure. I want to touch to one more sort of angle in your career, which I find fascinating, which is sort of the teaching aspect of it in academia and also sort of the journalism program or journalists for entrepreneurs. I want you to be able to sort of explain this a little bit better. But the reason why I want to talk about that is I want to talk about your experience as a brown woman sort of doing that because that's an unexpected sort of. I wonder how your students or how the people that you impact through those programs take you being in that position. And I'll just sort of quickly share sort of my experience sort of with teaching and in this space. So I came for my grad school back when I was based in Pakistan. I came for my grad school in journalism to Columbia,
Hmm.
studied for a year at Columbia, and then went back and was like, oh, I've learned all these cool things. I want to go back to Pakistan and teach Pakistani kids how to do journalism from here to
Oh,
make that
cool.
journalism
Yeah.
better. And it was the best thing that I've ever done in my life. Like having students, like, you talk about changing the world. Like changing the world is such a abstract idea that even when you're doing it, you can't feel it. But when you teach someone and when you can see the impact that you're having on their life and when they still reach out to you, like now I have like my students who are journalism professors themselves in the school in which I was teaching. And now they're inviting me for guest lectures. And I'm just like, I feel like my daughter is like 2 years old. So I don't know what this feels like, but I'm just like, I feel like the king of the world where, you
Oh.
teach someone and now they can go and take that on forward. And it's like this virtual cycle. So it brings me so much joy, but I'm curious to hear like how you got into that, what your journey's like, and what you're up to sort of in that space.
Yeah, thank you for picking up on that thread and bringing it up because it's relatively new in how I'm
Mm-hmm.
exploring it. But I think that when I was growing up, people say, "What did you want to be when you were like a kid?" Like I wanted to be a teacher, and
Mm.
I think I have a natural inclination for teaching. My dad is kind of like he loves an audience. He loves to tell people. He's very wise. Like he has a lot of great stories, but he also enjoys kind of like I don't want to say lecturing because it sounds bad, but truly like, I think he has
All
that teacher.
Pakistani dads enjoy
Yeah.
that, but okay, keep going.
He has that teacher instinct, and I think I sort of picked it up from him. I also loved so many of my teachers when I was in school. Like I stayed in touch with some of them like my whole life. I'm still in touch with them, my high school teachers and some of my college professors. Teaching was something I was thinking about seriously when I finished college. So it was always there, right? Like, but I got so into the journalism, and I always thought, okay, maybe one day I could teach journalism. I just didn't know how to break into it. And then COVID happened, and my kids. So Sufi was in, I think that was his first grade year when COVID happened, and my daughter Jahan was just in preschool. And they came home, and all of a sudden I'm like, my freelance career, the nice thing is it's always been flexible, right? So I kind of like do a little bit less of that. A lot of things were kind of up in the air in that moment. And then I started shifting towards helping them with their schooling. And when the following fall came, I sort of decided instead of having Sufi sit in front of, they were going to do, virtual learning, sitting in front of a computer all day, which I just didn't think was healthy for a second grader. I was like, I'm just going to pull him out. I'll homeschool him this year.
Mm.
And so I spent that year homeschooling him and Jahan. That was her pre-K year, and I loved it. One, it's like I just spent a lot of time with my own children, but I remembered how much I liked teaching, and I had forgotten that that was something I had loved my whole life. And so coming out of the pandemic, I thought, let me give it like a serious go. I called some of the journalism programs near my house. Hey, like this is who I am. Do you need an adjunct? And it took me a full year before they called me back, but the College of New
Wow.
Jersey, which is 15 minutes away from my house, was like,
Hmm.
hey, do you want to teach a class starting in 2 weeks? And I'm like, yes, I do. I do want to teach a class. And they're like, okay, great. So we have this class, Race and Gender in the News, and the professor is taking medical leave. And would you like to teach it? And I was just like, I cannot, like, pinch me because I thought, okay, I'd have to teach like journalism basics 101,
Yeah.
like, or do you want to teach race and gender in the news? Like, it just finished last week.
Hmm.
It was a semester. It was incredible. It was difficult. I saw how
Hmm.
thankless teaching can feel.
Yeah.
These students, like, they feel pretty entitled, and like, there's a lot of challenges with getting them to
Yeah.
engage, and they're college students. But
Hmm.
I told them on the first day, I was like, this is my first, I'm an adjunct. A lot of them don't
Hmm.
know what that is. So like, I'm an adjunct. This is the only class I teach. This is the only reason I'm on campus. The rest of my day I
Yeah.
work. And then I told them, this is my first class at TCNJ, but I didn't tell them it was my first college class ever, because I thought they'd be like, oh my God, she doesn't know what she's doing.
Yeah.
But on the last day, I said, hey, I didn't tell you this on the first day because I didn't want you to think I was totally inexperienced. But this is actually the first time I've taught a college class. And
Hmm.
it was an incredible experience. And I'm really grateful for all of you for giving that to me. And one of my students stayed after class, and then he came up to me and he's like, this is the first time you've done this? And I was like, yeah. And he's like, you're really good at it, And
Ooh.
it's just like, okay,
Yeah.
whatever, like, hell, you guys put me through all semester. I'm chasing you down. Hey, you got to get your assignments or whatever. Like, in that moment, I was like, I think I am good at it. And I think,
Hmm.
especially because I'm a mom and I'm very nurturing, I have this approach with the students that, especially like, post pandemic, college students
Yeah.
are really struggling. It's tough. They're,
Hmm.
all of them at some point in high school or college had a full year and a half where things were so deeply disrupted at this formative age. And it's a tough time to be in
Hmm.
college. I can't imagine having had that happen when I was in those years. So I think that, they kind of need that a little bit. And I really loved it. So I don't know what happens to that going forward, because actually getting into teaching as a career is really tough now,
Hmm.
unfortunately. Like,
Hmm.
it's just, campuses are, universities are so different now in how they
Hmm.
think of the economics of that. And we'll see. But one thing I realized is that as an editor in a newsroom, you also kind of get to mentor and teach, right? So teaching
Yeah.
happens in a lot of ways. I teach my children
Hmm.
every day.
Hmm.
We teach each other. Maybe even through this podcast, you're doing an element of teaching. So, teaching is much broader of a concept than like literally being a
Yeah.
teacher. But I do. It's important to me, and I think I'm getting old enough that I'm like,
Hmm.
maybe I'm not going to be doing like daily reporting and
Hmm.
like traditional journalism forever. Maybe I'm getting to a point where I want to start nurturing a new generation of people and getting them excited about doing this. And that feels super rewarding to me, because nobody's thinking about becoming a journalist. I was teaching a
Yeah.
journalism class, and only 5 of my students actually wanted to go in journalism.
What do the rest want to do?
Communications or
Okay.
marketing or other things, and they were just taking it because they liked the topic. But I don't blame them, like, what
Yeah.
kind of job are they going to get? What kind of pay are they
Yeah.
going to get? Like, it's not a field with many prospects. So, like, why would you go into it, I guess? Yeah,
For
it's
sure.
unfortunate, but I feel so much that we of course need to be in conversation with one another, and journalism is a core part of what the world needs. That's so cool, that
Yeah.
experience you had in Pakistan, because I would love to do something like that. I'd love to go to Pakistan and teach journalism. I'm thinking
Oh, that
about
is so
doing a
cool.
journalism camp in our town for like maybe like middle school level. My son is sort of encouraging me to do that. I'm like, yeah, maybe I could
Yeah.
run like a school paper. Like, there's so many ways that I just want to like
Yeah.
spread the gospel. Like, we need
Yeah.
people who are like investigating and thinking about how society works, and then talking about that. We need a conversation, a watering. Um, I'm mixing metaphors, but like a watering cooler, or like a place to gather that we talk about things. Yeah, I'm gonna get off my soapbox now.
No, this is amazing. So I'm gonna bring a lot of these different threads about your life together now and talk about where you stand today. Um, there's so many interesting journeys that you've been through on identity, on career. There's just so many things that you do even within sort of a career perspective. You've got Central Desi, you've got freelancing, you've got teaching, you're a mother. On top of that, you take the moment to really think about identity and life in a deeper and meaningful way. Like, I feel like, you know, the reason why you are so articulate and thoughtful about these things is because you think about them day in and day out. Like, it feels like it's something that comes together. Um, how do you see yourself in terms of where you are today? You know, you've been through an identity journey. Do you still feel um, confused? Do you still feel in two worlds, or do you feel like now I have an idea of who I am? Like, talk to us a little bit about where you stand today as you see all of this sort of come together.
Yeah, that's a great question. And as we're talking, I'm just thinking like this has been an incredible therapy session for me
Yeah.
because I've kind of like reframed my narrative about who I am, and I'm thinking about it all now. And I love how you're kind of bringing it full circle. So thank you for that. But you know what I have realized is that, and I've learned this through my kids, because when my children were born, I was like looking at them like, hey, you are full-blooded American kids born on this soil. Nobody can take that from you. What is your connection to Pakistan? I don't know. You know, like all those identity things like came back to me. And through them, I realized that I'm an American, right? Like, why have I not
Yeah.
said that to myself my
Yeah.
entire adulthood, my, you know, upbringing? And Bilal, my husband, actually, like, you know, I mentioned he was in Germany. He was actually in Canada. Then he came to Houston. He didn't even become an American citizen until I knew him in his late 20s. So even
Mhm.
he never really felt American,
Mhm.
I think. And I think both of us have kind of leaned into like, this is where we live. This is where we've lived
Mhm.
our lives. This is where we're raising our
Mhm.
children. This is home. And
Mhm.
I told my brother this the other day. I was like, you know, we were immigrants, but we can't be immigrants forever. What's
Mhm.
the plan? Like, the plan is
Mhm.
I don't want my kids running around the world. I want them to have home. I missed
Mhm.
that a little bit growing up.
Mhm.
I want them to have a sense of this is where I belong to, this is what I come back to.
Mhm.
And that's not going to be Pakistan. It's going to be
Mhm.
here, you know, and
Mhm.
I tell people now, like in a lot of ways, you know, Pakistan is in such a chaotic place right now, and it's really hard to know what's going to happen with it.
Mhm.
But
Mhm.
it's really unfortunate. And I say, like in a lot of ways, being Pakistani or Pakistan, it lives in my heart. Is what it
Mhm.
is. Like it's a culture, it's a concept, it's a way of living, it's a way of being. It's not just a national border that was drawn in 1947,
Yeah.
and you know God knows what's going to happen to it. I'm curious to see the stats on how many Pakistanis live outside of Pakistan.
Yeah.
I bet it's huge, and how it's compared
Mhm.
to other countries. There's so many Pakistani expats, and every year I feel like more Pakistanis are leaving. You know, of course, plenty are going back and deciding
Mhm.
to stay and all that, and I really respect that too. But I think we have to be realistic that, you know, people like you and I, if
Mhm.
we never get to go back to Pakistan and live there, that
Mhm.
we should find a way to keep it with us, keep it in our
Yeah.
hearts, because there's something really a lot about that culture that I don't want to lose and I want my kids
Mhm.
to have. But they live in America and they're Americans, and I live in America and I'm an American. And the problem has not been a questioning of my American identity this whole
Mhm.
time. It's been that America hasn't been inclusive enough about what it means to be American.
Mhm.
And it's
Mhm.
my job to make that more inclusive. And that's where I sit on the identity thing now, is for the sake of my children, I
Mm.
demand that everybody sees me as an American, because this is what I am. This is
Yeah.
what an American looks like.
Yeah.
Okay? And increasingly that is true. Like more and
Mhm.
more like children of immigrants are here, and we're here.
Mhm.
This is where we're going to be, and this
Mhm.
is America. You know, it's like
Mhm.
my one of my favorite songs. It's just it's changed a lot. I've become a
Mhm.
little bit kind of ardent about that. And now when I think about 9/11, I realize like going into college with that experience shaped my whole life, because
Yeah.
it threw my identity into question. I didn't feel like I belonged. I already had this sense like I was the awkward kid, that didn't know how to be American, didn't know the cool things. And then that happened, and I thought, oh, yeah, look, I'm a Muslim. Like, actually, Muslims are at war with America. America's at war with Muslims. So how could I be both things? And I realized, like, it's like the damage of 9/11 that I think our generation of
Yeah.
these Americans have, and we haven't processed it. And, like, maybe that's some of the work we need to do. And I'm starting to think about how I want to do that. But yeah, that's where I am now. And this is a moment in the time too. I don't know where I'll be 20
Yeah.
years from now. There's such a good book on this topic by Ayad Akhtar called Homeland Elegies. Have you read it?
Yes.
Oh,
Yes.
and it just I felt like it spoke to my soul. Like what does it all mean? And where do you
Yeah.
end up? And I don't know where I end up. And I do hope and pray that like I get to live in Pakistan at some point because I still really love Pakistan. And logistically it's changed, with having children and stuff. But even, I think you're right. I married Bilal in some way to kind of keep a piece of that with me because sometimes he and I will sit around and we're like, let's just take the kids to like a village for a year in Pakistan. Let's just take them. And like, I'm
Yeah.
so glad I have had children with a person who wants that with me because at least that's not the barrier, like maybe it'll actually happen. I don't know.
Yeah, I think your children might rebel if that happens, but I think
Exactly.
just like your dad wants to eventually retire or wants to eventually land up in a village in Pakistan, maybe he might not do it, but maybe you and Bilal might. Who knows? Life has strange things
Yeah, I
happening
hope
to it.
so. Yeah.
This has been such a riveting conversation, and you really helped move the conversation forward in my head. Prior to this, I was speaking to Kiran Khalid, and she was on the podcast. She talked about how, like, for her identity, her Pakistaniness was a defining feature, whereas for her kids, it would be one of the many influences. So it wouldn't be the defining feature, but it would be one of the many influences that would allow them to become who they want to become. And I think what you're arguing right now is not only are you American and coming to the realization that you are, and that this binary between American and Muslim, and it's a false sort of binary, but that America also needs to accept you as being American. It's not just you coming to terms with your identity, but it's America coming to terms with your identity and with our identity. And it's interesting. I think I'm like 10 years behind you, where I'm still trying to see the American in the mirror, and I can't find them because I can't see that Americans look like that. And I think it's people like you who are going to blaze that trail. When people like you can see yourselves as Americans and can speak in public forums and can show that there is a pathway for others to emerge sort of behind, I think it's just such an interesting, you know, threads, parallel threads that are running through all of us and sort of, still connect and inspire us as we learn from each other and how our journeys are so different and yet so similar.
I hope you're right. And I really am grateful for you for seeing it that way and for, putting that idea out there. I hope that's true. It's hard to see, you said yourself, like when you're impacting the world, it's hard to see when you're making a change. And a lot of times I question, is it healthy to put yourself out there? We live in the influencer era, right? And I really want to be careful. Like, I don't want to get caught in the, like, I want to have the mic kind of attitude. I don't need that. What fulfills me, like I need to be with my loved ones. I need to have, time to take long walks in nature. I don't need to be famous, which is like become the thing that so many of us, like, because of social media, like, are craving. And so I'm really wary of that. And at the same time, I feel like I've gotten to an age where I'm thinking nobody's having these conversations. Well, who's going to do it? Like, maybe somebody just needs to do it. And maybe people are waiting, like, yeah, I think a lot of people, like, want to have this conversation, but who's going to pick up the mic and start? And that's a responsibility, right? So that's the other side of the coin. It's not that you're picking up the mic because you're like, look at me, like I'm the important one. I'm the one that represents this community. I can tell you what it's like. This is the experience. I don't want to be a talking head, right? I don't ever want to be in that position. But I do think that as I've started to open up a bit and started to talk, I'm like, yeah, this is really important. We need to process like our collective experience, and we need to start having a conversation about, right? Like what we just talked about America needing to accept us. This whole DEI conversation is so interesting. And to me, it's like the door cracked open, and then maybe even closed a little bit since then. And how much of a dent can you make? And when the door is like a little bit open, can you shove your foot in it and just try to like crack it open, because it's a little bit open? So take the opportunity. And that's what I hope, this, like, I hope that that's what your podcast is doing. I hope that that's what, the efforts that I'm making is doing. And I hope that more and more people, like, they're like, I want to do this too, because we need a lot of people to crack that door open. Like one person is not going to make a difference, right? But we need to speak up for ourselves. And our parents were that immigrant generation, keep your head down, don't get in trouble. Fine, that's, I respect that. But we can't adopt that mentality, because nobody's going to talk for us. Nobody's going, people will talk for us, but nobody's going to advocate for us. We will be silenced if we silence ourselves. So we have to stop. We have to work against that inclination we have to be kind of humble and like put ourselves out there and say, we're here. No, this is definitely, I'm not a Pakistani that's like, no, I'm from here. This is me. I'm an American, and I'm sorry that you didn't acknowledge that I was American this whole time, but that's literally what I am. So get used to it.
Yeah, no, for sure. That's a beautiful, beautiful thought. And I think the other thing that I just want to elevate here is like the idea of having more of us speak sort of publicly and share our stories. We come from a culture where we don't, like a lot of things, we don't talk about our feelings. We don't talk about them in our home, let alone sort of talking them out loud. But the reason why it's important, I'll give a small metaphor for how this is, important, is we would have never met had we not sort of put ourselves out there. And then the first time we chatted, I was like, my God, like Ambreen has lived my life. And like parts of my life that I haven't lived yet, and I need to, like, if I can just talk to her and learn from her, like it'll save me like 10 years of heartbreak. And that's what you realize, like we're not alone. Like suddenly the feeling of community and the feeling of realizing that, oh, there's someone else like me. And you talked about, what was it like growing up as a Pakistani American, and you're like, it felt lonely. So it feels to me like such a no-brainer where I'm like, you feel lonely. What do? You talk about it and you find other people like you, but we just can't get over the initial huddle to be like, it's okay. We're all going through it. And this makes me really happy. And I think we need more people to come out there and to share this, because we'll realize like everybody's experience is different, but there's so much that we can learn from each other.
Absolutely, yeah. And that hurdle, that getting over it, it's not a small hurdle, because it requires vulnerability, right? And that hesitation we had in the beginning to share things, because our parents might listen to this later, or, we might be judged for it. That's not a small thing. That is a hard thing to overcome for a lot of people in our community. And that's okay. It's okay that it's hard. Like let's find a way to take baby steps. But I think we'll all feel a lot better if we start being a little bit more kind of real with one another.
Absolutely. Well, on that note, we're going to wrap this podcast. I feel like, Amreen, I could have talked to you for like 3 more days.
I know. I'm like, is it already?
And I'm like, there's so many. I want to unpack your undergrad. I want to pack like other parts of your identity. Like, I want to unpack the auntie. There's so much there, but this is why it's important to do it. We're gonna have you again back soon, because this is
I would love that. I would really love that. Yeah, this was truly so fun, and you are really good at this, and I'm so glad you're doing this. I can't wait to hear the other episodes. I know Karen, and I've never had that conversation with her, so I can't wait to hear what she said about it. And again, like, I would love to be in conversation with this community, so I'm so glad you're creating this.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ambreen.
Thank you.